Most people, when they look at Blackwood Manor, see a haunted house, a wreck, a skeletal, Gothic monstrosity looming on a hill overlooking the town of Havenwood, its windows like vacant, staring eyes. They see broken shutters, a sagging roof, and a century of neglect. They see the ghost of a madman. When I first saw it, on a crisp, clear autumn afternoon, I saw something else entirely. I saw a beautiful, forgotten story. I saw the elegant, proud lines of a masterpiece of Victorian architecture, hidden beneath the grime and the decay. I saw a house with secrets, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I was the one who was meant to learn them. My name is Eleanor Vance, and I am a historical restorationist. It's a fancy title for a person who loves old, broken things. I see the beauty in the decay, the history in the dust. And Blackwood Manor was the most beautiful, broken thing I had ever seen. The whole town thought I was a fool for buying it. They had no idea I was about to solve their oldest, most famous mystery. Have you ever walked into a small town where everyone knows everyone, and you are the immediate, obvious outsider? It's a strange feeling. Every conversation is a test. Every smile is a judgment. If you've ever been the new person in a place with a long memory, you know the vibe. Hit that subscribe button, because the welcome I got in Havenwood was a special kind of cold. I came to Havenwood, a picturesque, postcard-perfect town in rural Vermont, in search of peace. The last 2 years of my life had been a blur of grief. I had lost both of my parents in a sudden, senseless car accident. They had left me with a profound, aching void in my heart, and a surprisingly large inheritance. They had been quiet, frugal people, and their life insurance and investments had left me with enough money to leave my busy, stressful life in Boston behind and start over. I didn't want a new city. I wanted quiet. I wanted a project, something to pour my grief and my energy into, a place where I could heal. I drove through a dozen small towns in New England, but none of them felt right, until I drove over the crest of a hill and saw Havenwood, nestled in a valley below, and on the hill overlooking the town, I saw it, Blackwood Manor. It was love at first sight. My first stop in town was the local general store, a charming, cluttered place with a bell that jingled when I opened the door. The woman behind the counter, a woman with a formidable perm and eyes that missed nothing, introduced herself as Brenda. She was, I would soon learn, the central nervous system of the town's gossip network. "You're new here," she stated, her tone not a question, but an observation. Yes, I smiled. "I'm thinking of moving here. I saw the old house on the hill, the Blackwood place. Do you know if it's for sale?" Brenda's perfectly plucked eyebrows shot up to her hairline. She let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. "For sale, honey. That place has been for sale for 50 years. No one in their right mind would buy it. You're not thinking of—" "I am," I said. She just stared at me, then a slow, pitying smile spread across her face. "Well, you're brave, I'll give you that. Or crazy. You know the stories, I assume." "I don't." I said I'd love to hear them. And that was all the invitation Brenda needed. She leaned forward, her elbows on the counter, and she told me the legend of Silas Blackwood. Silas, she explained, had founded the town in the mid-1800s. He was an eccentric genius, an inventor and an architect who had made a massive, mysterious fortune out west during the gold rush. He had returned to Vermont and had spent a decade building his masterpiece, Blackwood Manor, a bizarre and beautiful Gothic revival mansion that was completely out of place in the simple, colonial landscape of New England. He was a strange man, Brenda whispered, her eyes wide. He never married, had no children. He lived alone in that massive house, and as he got older, he got stranger. He became a recluse, paranoid. He was convinced that people, his own family back in Boston, were trying to steal his gold. The legend, she said, was that in his final years, Silas Blackwood had hidden his entire fortune, a massive trove of gold coins, from his prospecting days, somewhere inside the walls of the mansion. He died in the house in the winter of 1899, and on his deathbed, he had supposedly told his only visitor, the town doctor, "They will never find it. My ghost will guard it forever." "And people say he does," Brenda concluded, her voice a dramatic whisper. They say you can still see the lights on in the tower on stormy nights. They say you can hear him walking the halls. He's guarding his gold. People have been searching for that treasure for 100 years. Treasure hunters, distant relatives, kids on a dare. No one has ever found a single coin. I was completely, utterly captivated. A haunted mansion, an eccentric genius, and a hidden treasure. It wasn't a wreck. It was a novel waiting to be written. Well, I said, my smile genuine. It sounds like my kind of place. Brenda just shook her head, a look of profound pity on her face for the foolish city slicker who was in way over her head. My next stop was the town hall, a beautiful, white-steepled colonial building on the town green. I went to the records office to inquire about the ownership of the Blackwood property. The clerk directed me to the office of the mayor himself, a man named Mr. Abernathy, who was also, conveniently, the head of the Havenwood Historical Society. Mr. Abernathy was a man in his 60s, with a stern face and a bow tie that was just a little too tight. He was the gatekeeper of the town's history, and he looked at me with the deep suspicion that small town officials reserve for outsiders with new ideas. "You're interested in the Blackwood Manor?" he asked, peering at me over the top of his glasses. He made a small, tisking sound. "Young lady, I feel it is my civic duty to advise you against it. The place is a complete ruin, a teardown. The Historical Society has tried for years to raise the funds to have it stabilized, but it's a money pit. The roof is gone. The foundation is crumbling. It would take a fortune to make it habitable. I'm a historical restorationist by trade, Mr. Abernathy," I explained, "and I have the funds to do it properly. It's my passion." He looked at me with open skepticism. "A passion project," he said. The words, a dismissal, and what about its reputation? "The stories, you are aware that the house is considered to be haunted. The stories are precisely why I'm interested," I said with a smile. "I'm a historian. I love a good story, and I believe that behind every legend, there is a kernel of truth. I want to find it." He just shook his head, a look of weary condescension on his face. "Many have tried, young lady. The house has been picked apart by treasure hunters for a century. There is nothing there but rot and old ghosts. But," he sighed, "if you are determined to throw your money away, the property is currently owned by the town. It was seized for back taxes 20 years ago. We have been trying to sell it ever since. The asking price is insultingly low. No one has been foolish enough to pay it." "Well," I said, pulling my checkbook out of my purse, "I believe I am that foolish." The look on his face as I wrote out a check for the full asking price right there in his office was a beautiful thing to behold. It was a mixture of shock, disbelief, and a deep, profound suspicion. He, like everyone else in this town, could not comprehend why a young woman from the city would want to buy their local ruin. They saw me as a naive fool with more money than sense. They had no idea that my love for old, broken things was matched only by my love for a good, old, unsolved mystery. I walked out of the town hall that afternoon with a set of old, heavy, iron keys in my hand, the keys to Blackwood Manor. I drove up the long, winding, and overgrown driveway to the house on the hill. It was even more magnificent, and more dilapidated. Up close, the paint was peeling, the shutters were hanging from their hinges, and the grand front porch was sagging precariously. But the bones of the house were beautiful, the elegant lines, the intricate gingerbread trim, the towering witch hat turret. It was a masterpiece, sleeping under a century of neglect. I stood on the porch, the keys feeling heavy and real in my palm. The entire town of Havenwood was spread out below me, a quiet, perfect little snow globe of a town that was, at this very moment, probably buzzing with the news of the crazy city woman who had just bought the haunted mansion. They were all laughing at me. I was sure of it. I looked up at the house. It was not a haunted wreck to me. It was a puzzle, a challenge, a story waiting to be told. The town could have its ghosts. I was here for the history. I slid the heavy, old key into the lock. It turned with a loud, grating, satisfying clunk, and I pushed the door open, stepping out of the bright afternoon sun and into the cool, dusty, and secret-filled darkness of my new home. The hunt had begun. The inside of Blackwood Manor smelled of 100 years of secrets. It was a thick, complex perfume of damp plaster, decaying wood, dust, and the faint, ghostly scent of myrrh from the peeling. Water-stained wallpaper in the grand foyer. The air was heavy and still, and the light that filtered through the grimy, leaded glass windows was thin and gray, illuminating swirling motes of dust like tiny, dancing spirits. Most people would have been terrified. They would have felt the oppressive weight of the house's reputation, listened for the spectral footsteps of its mad, dead owner. I felt none of that. As I stood in the grand, two-story entrance hall, my footsteps echoing on the marble floor, I felt a profound sense of peace. I was not a trespasser in a haunted house. I was a historian who had just been given access to the most fascinating archive of her life. I was a doctor, and this beautiful, broken house was my patient, and I couldn't wait to begin the surgery. The first 2 weeks were a solitary, grueling, and deeply satisfying exploration. I didn't hire a crew yet. This initial phase was about assessment, about listening to the house, about understanding the scope of the work ahead. I moved from room to room, a crowbar in one hand and a digital camera in the other, my own personal archaeological dig. The decay was extensive, it was true. Plaster had crumbled from the walls in great, sad sheets. The damp had warped the beautiful hardwood floors in the ballroom into a miniature mountain range. But the bones of the house, oh, the bones were magnificent. The woodwork was incredible, hand-carved from a dark, heavy oak, with intricate details that you simply don't see anymore. The grand staircase, though covered in a thick carpet of dust, was a masterpiece of engineering. Its banister a single, flowing, serpentine piece of carved wood. In the library, behind the grime on the windows, I discovered that they were not plain glass, but stained glass, depicting scenes from Shakespeare and Dante. This was not the work of a madman. This was the work of a genius, a brilliant, eccentric, and deeply artistic man who had poured his soul and his fortune into creating a house that was not just a home, but a work of art. My trips into the small town of Havenwood for supplies were a jarring contrast to the quiet, focused solitude of my work at the manor. I quickly learned that my purchase of the Blackwood place had made me the single most fascinating, and most foolish, subject of town gossip. Every trip to the general store was an exercise in enduring the thinly veiled pity and morbid curiosity of the locals. Brenda, the woman with the formidable perm and the even more formidable gossip network, was my primary tormentor. She would greet me with a smile that was all teeth and condescension. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," she'd say, loud enough for the entire store to hear. "It's the lady of the manor. Tell me, dearie, have you met our ghost yet?" "Not yet, Brenda," I'd say with a pleasant smile. "I'm sure he's just shy." "Oh, he's not shy," she'd cackle. "He's just waiting, old man Hemlock. He tried to fix the roof back in the 60s, went up on a ladder, and he swore a cold, invisible hand just pushed him right off, broke his leg in 3 places. He never went back up there." The other customers in the store would nod along, their faces grave. They were all members of the same Greek chorus, singing the same song of warning. "And the noises," another woman would chime in. "Have you heard the noises at night? They say it sounds like a heavy chest being dragged across the floorboards in the attic. That's him, you know, old man Blackwood, moving his gold around, so no one can find it." They would all look at me then, their eyes wide, waiting for me to be terrified, waiting for me to admit that I had made a terrible mistake. I would just smile, pay for my plaster and my wood glue, and leave. Their whispers would follow me out the door. "Poor thing. She has no idea what she's gotten herself into." The isolation began to wear on me. I was a private person by nature, but the feeling of being the town lunatic, the foolish outsider who was the subject of constant gossip and pity, was a heavy cloak to wear. I needed a break from it. I needed a place of quiet, of facts, of sanity. I found it, as I so often have in my life, in the town library. The Havenwood Public Library was a small, beautiful stone building just off the town green. It was a quiet, peaceful haven that smelled of old paper and beeswax. And it was there that I met my first, and only, ally in this strange new town. His name was Arthur. He was the town librarian. a man in his late 70s with kind, intelligent eyes and a gentle demeanor that was the polar opposite of Brenda's sharp-edged gossip. He was sitting at the main desk when I walked in, reading a thick, leather-bound book. He looked up and smiled a genuine, welcoming smile. "Can I help you?" "Yes," I said, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. "I'm Eleanor Vance. I'm the new owner of the Blackwood Manor." His eyebrows shot up, but his expression was not one of pity or mockery. It was one of pure, academic excitement. "Good heavens," he breathed. "So it's true. Someone has finally had the courage to take it on. What a magnificent, misunderstood building. It is an absolute architectural treasure." I could have hugged him. He was the first person in this entire town who didn't look at me like I was a fool. He saw the house the same way I did. "I was hoping you might have some materials on it," I said, "on its history, on the founder, Silas Blackwood." Arthur's face lit up. He stood up, his eyes gleaming with a passion I recognized instantly. The passion of a fellow historian who has just been asked about his favorite subject. "My dear Miss Vance," he said, his voice a happy, conspiratorial whisper, "you have come to the right place. Everyone in this town is obsessed with the ghost of Silas Blackwood. No one, in 50 years, has ever bothered to ask about the man himself." He led me from the main library into a small, dusty, and climate-controlled room in the back, the town archives. Silas Blackwood, he explained as he unlocked the door, was a genius, a brilliant, self-taught architect, an inventor, a polymath. But he was also an eccentric, a recluse. And this town, in its infinite wisdom, has always preferred a simple ghost story to a complex historical reality. He pulled a rolling ladder over to a high shelf. When he died, he continued, climbing the ladder with a surprising agility. He had no heirs, so he bequeathed his most valuable possession to the town of Havenwood. Not his gold, but his mind. He reached up and pulled a series of thick, leather-bound, and deeply dusty volumes from the top shelf. He left his entire personal library, and all of his private papers. "To this library," he said, carefully climbing back down. He placed the heavy volumes on a large wooden table, including his personal journals. 22 volumes, covering 30 years of his life. No one has checked them out in my entire 35-year tenure as town librarian. They're all here, waiting for someone to read them. He looked at me, his eyes full of a shared, scholarly excitement. "I have a feeling, Miss Vance," he said with a smile, "that you are the person Silas Blackwood has been waiting for." I stood there, in the quiet, dusty archives, and I stared at the pile of journals on the table. It was a treasure trove. It was the key, the answer to the mystery of the house, of the man, and perhaps even of the gold, was right here in these pages. That evening, I sat in my own dusty, chaotic library at Blackwood Manor, a fire crackling in the massive stone fireplace, a cup of tea on the table beside me, and I opened the first volume of Silas Blackwood's journals. The paper was thick and yellowed with age, and the handwriting. The handwriting was beautiful, a strong, elegant, and intelligent script. It was not the handwriting of a madman. I turned to the first page and I began to read. October 12th, 1865. The work on the foundation is complete. I have laid the first stone of my great puzzle. The world sees a house, but it is so much more. It is a game, an architectural riddle. And the answer, my dear reader, is written not in ink, but in stone, and wood, and glass. The town could keep their ghost stories. I was going to find the man, and I had a very strong feeling that he, in his own words, was about to tell me exactly where he had hidden his gold. My life for the next 2 months became a quiet, obsessive, and deeply joyful dialogue with a dead man. The world outside Blackwood Manor, the world of Havenwood with its whispers and its pitying looks, simply faded away. My world shrank to the dusty, sun-drenched rooms of the mansion and the quiet, hallowed archives of the town library. And at the center of that world was Silas Blackwood. Arthur, my new and only friend, was my co-conspirator. He would bring me a thermos of hot tea and a sandwich every day as I sat at a large oak table in the archives, surrounded by the 22 leather-bound volumes of Silas's life. Reading a person's private journals is a profound and intimate act. It's like being invited into the most secret room of their soul. And the man I discovered in those pages was a universe, away from the one-dimensional madman of the town's legend. He was not mad. He was a genius, a brilliant, restless, and deeply lonely one. His journals were not the ramblings of a lunatic. They were a breathtaking testament to a mind that was constantly at work. The pages were filled with complex mathematical equations, with detailed architectural sketches for inventions that were 100 years ahead of their time, with philosophical musings, and with long passages written in fluent Latin and Greek. He wrote of his love for the house, his symphony in stone and wood. He documented every single stage of its construction, every beam, every nail, every pane of glass. He was not just building a home, he was creating a legacy, a puzzle box, a testament to his own complex mind. And yes, in the later journals, the paranoia was there. It was a palpable thing, but it was not the paranoia of a madman. It was the sharp, weary paranoia of a brilliant man surrounded by fools and vultures. He wrote of his distant relatives in Boston, his only living family, with a cutting, cynical disdain. My cousins have written again. One entry from 1898 read, "They do not ask of my health or my work. They ask only of my investments. They are waiting for me to die. They circle my life like buzzards, eager to pick over the bones of my fortune. They will be disappointed. They think my gold is a simple treasure to be found. They do not understand that the real treasure is the search itself." He knew they were after his money, and he was determined to create a lock that only a certain kind of mind could open. He was not just hiding his gold. He was building a test, a riddle, and he was leaving the clues for a person he had never met. A person who, he hoped, would one day love his house as much as he did. Every small town has two kinds of history, the one they tell the tourists, full of ghosts and easy legends, and the real one, the one that's gathering dust in the library archives. The town of Havenwood was obsessed with their ghost story. I was interested in the truth, and Arthur, my friend, had just handed me the key. The first clue was a phrase, a quote that Silas repeated over and over again in his final years, a near obsession. It was from the Roman poet Ovid, from his masterpiece, Metamorphoses, Aurum, et quod avidis manibus attractaverat, aurumerat. My Latin was rusty, but I knew the line. It was from the story of King Midas, the man with the golden touch, gold, and what he had touched with his greedy hands was gold. On its own, it was just the literary musing of a classically educated man, but he had written it dozens of times, sometimes scrawling it in the margins of his architectural drawings. It was more than a quote, it was a clue, but to what? The second piece of the puzzle came not from the journals, but from the town hall. Arthur, using his authority as the head of the historical society, managed to unearth the original, rolled-up linen blueprints of the mansion, which had been filed away in a dusty tube in the basement for a century. We carefully unrolled them on the largest table in the library. They were beautiful, hand-drawn with an architect's precise, elegant hand. I spent days studying them, my restorationist's eye tracing every line, every measurement. It was a masterpiece of Victorian engineering. And then I found the anomaly. It was in the plans for the grand library of the manor, the very room where I was spending my evenings reading Silas's journals. The blueprints showed a hidden cavity, a void space, noted behind the massive stone fireplace. It was a space that did not correspond to any room on the floor above or below, and it was marked with a strange, small symbol, a letter M, with a tiny, elegant crown drawn over the top. "What do you make of that?" I asked Arthur, pointing to the strange symbol. "I'm not sure," he said, peering at it. Perhaps it was a maker's mark or a revision note, but I knew it was more than that. The pieces were starting to click together in my mind. The Midas quote, the hidden cavity behind the library fireplace, the crowned M. It was a riddle. That night, I went back to the manor, my heart pounding with a new excitement. I went straight to the library. The room was cold, the only light coming from the single lamp on the desk where I worked. I stood before the massive, cold, stone fireplace. It was an imposing structure, big enough to roast an ox in. The mantelpiece was a single, massive piece of carved oak, and I had never, in all my weeks of exploring the house, truly looked at it. I ran my fingers over the intricate carvings, and then I saw it. The carvings were not just decorative swirls, they were scenes, a series of panels that told a story, the story of King Midas. There he was, turning a rose to gold with a single touch. There he was, at his feast, his food and wine turning to solid metal in his hands. And there he was, in the final panel, embracing his own daughter, and turning her, too, into a golden, lifeless statue. And right in the center of the mantelpiece, directly above the fireplace opening, was a larger, central carving. It was a single, crowned letter M. The same symbol from the blueprints. I had it, the location. The gold was not in the attic, not in the cellar, not buried in the garden. It was here, inside the walls, behind this very fireplace. But then came the final piece of the riddle, the one that had eluded all the treasure hunters for a century. They had all been looking for the wrong thing. I thought back to the Midas quote. What he had touched with his greedy hands was gold. The townspeople, in their greed, had interpreted the legend literally. They were looking for a chest of gold coins, a pirate's treasure. But Silas was not a pirate. He was an architect, an artist. And I suddenly realized, with a jolt of insight so powerful it was like a physical shock, that he hadn't hidden his gold. He had transformed it. He hadn't put his treasure in the house. The treasure was the house, or part of it. The gold wasn't a separate object. It was an architectural feature. It was a part of his great symphony in stone and wood. He had taken his gold, the source of his family's greed, and he had turned it into something beautiful, something permanent, something that could only be found by someone who took the time to understand him, to understand his work, to read his story. The legend was true. Blackwood Manor was haunted by a treasure, but it wasn't the treasure of a madman. It was the legacy of a genius. I stood in the silent, dusty library, the firelight from the hearth dancing on the walls. The house around me no longer felt empty. It felt alive. It felt like it was waiting, holding its breath, ready to finally give up its oldest, most beautiful secret. I placed my hand on the cold stone of the mantelpiece, directly below the carved, crowned M. The town could have their ghost. I had found the man, and I knew, with an absolute and thrilling certainty, exactly where he had hidden his gold. All I had to do now was break down a wall. The solution to Silas Blackwood's riddle was staring me right in the face, carved in oak and stone. The fireplace in the Grand Library was not just a fireplace. It was a signpost, a lock, and a doorway. My heart was pounding with the kind of pure, unadulterated excitement that only a historian on the verge of a major discovery can understand. The ghost stories, the legends of a madman's hidden gold, they were all just noise. A century of misdirection that had kept everyone from seeing the truth that was hidden in plain sight. My first call was to Arthur. He arrived at the manor that evening, his face alight with a conspiratorial glee. I walked him through my entire thought process. The Midas quote from the journals, the crowned M on the blueprints, and finally, the matching carvings on the mantelpiece itself. He stood before the fireplace, a look of profound awe on his face. "My dear Eleanor," he whispered, running a reverent hand over the carved oak. "It's brilliant, absolutely brilliant." They were all looking for a treasure chest. He never built a treasure chest. He built a treasure room. But now we had a practical problem. The hidden cavity was behind the fireplace. The structure was a masterpiece of 19th century stonework. The last thing I wanted to do was take a sledgehammer to it, as a restorationist. My primary oath is to do no harm. "So how do we get in?" Arthur asked, his eyes gleaming. "Not through the front," I said, my own professional instincts kicking in. He was too smart for that. He wouldn't make you destroy his beautiful mantelpiece to find his secret. I knelt down and peered into the deep, dark, and very sooty firebox. He would have built a back door. I spent the next day carefully cleaning the firebox. A messy, painstaking job. And just as I had suspected, I found it at the very back. Behind a layer of soot and loose bricks was a small, square iron plate, no bigger than a serving platter. with a small inset keyhole. It was a clean-out door, a common feature in old fireplaces. But this one felt different. It was the door to the riddle. The problem, of course, was that we didn't have the key. We searched Silas's journals again. We searched the blueprints, but there was no mention of it. For 2 days, we were stumped. We were so close, yet so far. The solution came from Arthur. He arrived at the manor on the 3rd day, holding a small, rusty metal box. "I found this in the library archives," he explained, in a box labeled Town Founder Miscellany. "I believe it's the original box of personal effects Silas had on him the day he died." We opened the box. Inside was a pocket watch, a pair of spectacles, a fountain pen, and a single, strange-looking, ornate iron key. My heart stopped. We rushed to the fireplace. I took the key, my hand trembling slightly. I slid it into the small, soot-covered keyhole at the back of the firebox. It fit perfectly. With a turn and a loud, grating clunk of old, rusted metal, the iron plate swung open, revealing a dark, musty-smelling cavity behind it. Arthur handed me a powerful flashlight. I took a deep breath, got down on my hands and knees, and crawled into the darkness. The space was small, a narrow crawl space, just as the blueprints had indicated. And at the end of it was another wall, this one made of plaster and lath. It was the false wall, the final barrier. This part, I knew, would require demolition. But it was a demolition I was prepared for, with my safety goggles on and a small crowbar in hand. I began to carefully, methodically, pry away the old plaster. It came away in large, dusty sheets, revealing the wooden laths beneath. It took another hour of careful work, but finally, I created an opening large enough to shine my flashlight through, and the beam of light landed on something that made the air leave my lungs in a single, sharp gasp. It was not stone. It was not plaster. It was metal, a wall of dark, burnished, gleaming metal that seemed to absorb and reflect the light in a strange, warm, and deeply unfamiliar way. "Arthur," I called out, my voice a strangled whisper, "you need to see this." We worked together to widen the opening, and then he crawled in beside me. We sat there in the dusty, cramped crawl space, our flashlight beams dancing across the surface of the hidden wall. It was a small, perfectly square, windowless room, no bigger than a walk-in closet, and every single surface, the walls, the floor, the ceiling was covered in magnificent, interlocking metal panels. They looked like bronze, but they glowed with an inner fire, a deep golden luster that was unlike anything I had ever seen. And the panels were not blank. Every single one was intricately etched with drawings, with diagrams, with equations, with words. I ran my hand over the nearest panel. It was cool to the touch. The etchings were incredibly fine, a work of masterful artistry. I recognized some of them instantly. They were the architectural drawings from his journals, the designs for his impossible, brilliant inventions. There was a diagram for a self-winding clock, for a new kind of steam engine, for a flying machine that looked like something out of a Leonardo da Vinci notebook. On another wall were star charts, complex astronomical maps that were a beautiful, swirling chaos of constellations and celestial calculations. And on the ceiling, in elegant, swirling script, were quotes, etched in Latin and Greek, from his favorite Stoic philosophers, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, Epictetus. And finally, on the far wall, was the story of his life, a pictorial autobiography. There were scenes of him as a young man, heading west for the gold rush. There were images of him panning for gold in a California river. There were scenes of him on a ship, returning to Vermont, his fortune made. And there was the final panel, a beautiful, intricate etching of the house itself, Blackwood Manor, with the words, "Finis coronat opus, the end," crowns the work carved beneath it. It was his life story, his autobiography, his soul written in metal. The town had thought he was a madman, hiding a chest of common gold coins. But he had been an artist, a philosopher, a historian of his own life. He hadn't hidden his gold. He had transformed it into a timeless, secret monument to his own mind. This room, this beautiful, secret, golden room, was his real treasure. "It's beautiful," Arthur whispered, his voice full of a librarian's reverent awe. "But is it? I don't know. I breathed. I knew we had to find out. I found a tiny, loose flake of the metal on the edge of one of the lower panels, no bigger than my pinky nail. I carefully pried it off and placed it in a small, sterile evidence bag. The next day, I drove the 3 hours to Boston. I didn't go to a pawn shop or a jeweler. I went to a trusted contact from my old life, a professor of materials science and metallurgy at MIT, a man who owed me a favor. I sat in his lab as he placed the tiny, gleaming flake under a high-powered electron microscope and ran a series of tests. He was silent for a long time, his eyes fixed on his computer monitor. Then he let out a low, long whistle. "Good God, Eleanor," he said, turning to look at me, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Where on earth did you get this?" "It's from an architectural restoration project I'm working on," I said vaguely. "An old Victorian house." He shook his head in amazement. "This is not a normal metal. This is a bronze alloy." "Yes, but this top layer, this is 24-karat gold leaf, and it hasn't been plated. It's been fused to the bronze using a technique called fire gilding. It's an incredibly rare, incredibly difficult, and incredibly expensive process. It uses mercury vapor to bond the gold to the base metal. It was a technique favored by 18th century French royalty. I haven't seen a sample this pure in my entire career." "So it's valuable?" I asked, my heart pounding. He laughed, a loud, incredulous sound. "Is it valuable?" he repeated. "Eleanor, the gold content alone makes this sample precious. But a whole room of this panels of this size and intricacy, the historical, artistic, and metallurgical value. It's not just valuable, it's priceless. It's a national treasure. It belongs in a museum." I drove back to Havenwood that evening in a daze. Priceless. A national treasure, hidden in the walls of my dusty, dilapidated, haunted mansion. I stood again in the grand library, the fireplace now a gaping hole leading to my secret room. The town of Havenwood had spent a century laughing at the legend of Silas Blackwood's gold. They had gossiped about me, the foolish city woman who had bought his haunted wreck. They thought I was a fool, searching for a ghost treasure. They had no idea that I had already found it. And I knew, with a new, thrilling sense of power, that it was time to finally silence the whispers. It was time to show them the truth. It was time to throw a party. A very big, very loud, and very, very golden party. My plan was simple. My plan was theatrical. And my plan was, in its own way, a tribute to Silas Blackwood himself. He had built a puzzle box, and I was about to host a party for the grand unveiling. I spent the next month working with a furious, joyful energy. I hired a small, skilled crew of local craftsmen, and we focused on restoring just the main rooms of the ground floor, the grand foyer, the ballroom, and the library. We didn't renovate, we restored. We gently cleaned the century of grime from the hand-carved woodwork. We repaired the crumbling plasterwork. We polished the beautiful, wide plank hardwood floors until they shone with a deep, warm luster. The house was beginning to breathe again. And then I sent out the invitations. They were beautiful, printed on heavy, cream-colored cardstock in an elegant, 19th century script. Eleanor Vance cordially invites the residents of Havenwood to a restoration celebration at Blackwood Manor. They read, "Join us for an evening of music, refreshments, and a first look at the ongoing work to bring this historic treasure back to its former glory." I posted them on the community board at the town hall, at the post office, and with a small, secret smile, I handed a thick stack of them to Brenda at the general store. "For your customers," I said sweetly. She took them, her eyes wide with a suspicious, gossipy glee. The town began to buzz. The crazy city woman was throwing a party, in the haunted house. It was the most exciting thing to happen in Havenwood in years. The night of the party was clear and cold. I had roaring fires going in the 2 massive fireplaces in the ballroom and the library. I had hired a string quartet to play quietly in the corner. I had, using my old contacts, brought in a catering company from Boston that served exquisite food on gleaming silver trays. I had filled the house with light and music, and the smell of beeswax and apple cider. They began to arrive at 7 o'clock. They came in droves, the entire town, it seemed. Their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and neighborly obligation. They were expecting to walk into a dusty, spooky, half-renovated ruin. The looks on their faces as they stepped into the grand foyer were my first taste of victory. The room was magnificent. The marble floors gleamed. The massive crystal chandelier, now cleaned and rewired, cast a warm, glittering light on the newly restored woodwork. There were gasps. There were whispers. "I can't believe it," I heard one woman say. "It's beautiful." I greeted them all at the door, the perfect, gracious hostess. I saw Mayor Abernathy arrive, his stern face a mask of grudging surprise. I saw Brenda, her perm practically vibrating with the effort of trying to find something to criticize. For the first hour, I let them mingle. I let them wander through the restored rooms, their skepticism slowly, visibly, melting away, replaced by a new, grudging respect. They were seeing the house not as a haunted wreck, but as the architectural masterpiece it truly was. At 8:30, I stood on the grand staircase and clinked a glass for attention. "Welcome, everyone," I said, my voice clear and confident, echoing through the now quiet hall. "Thank you all so much for coming. When I first bought this house, I know many of you thought I was a little crazy." A ripple of nervous laughter went through the crowd. "And you were right too," I continued with a smile. "You saw a ruin, a haunted, lost cause. But I saw something else. I saw a story. And tonight, I would like to share that story with you." I led them on a tour, my voice filling the rooms as I told them the history of the house, of the details I had uncovered, of the craftsmanship that had gone into its creation. But the final stop on the tour was the library. The room was warm and inviting, the fire crackling in the massive stone hearth. The room fell silent as I stood before the fireplace, before the intricately carved Midas mantelpiece. "You all know the legend of Blackwood Manor," I began, my voice now a low, storyteller's hum, the story of the madman, Silas Blackwood, and his hidden gold, the story of his ghost, guarding his treasure for 100 years. This town has been searching for that gold. You have been looking for a ghost story. I paused, letting my words hang in the air. "But you were looking for the wrong story," I said. Silas Blackwood was not a madman. He was a genius, a puzzle maker, and he didn't leave behind a ghost story. He left behind a riddle, and the answer to that riddle has been here all along, hidden in plain sight. I walked them through it. I told them about the journals, about Arthur the librarian, my quiet, steadfast ally, who stood beaming in the back of the room. I told them about the repeated Ovid quote, about the story of King Midas. I showed them the copy of the blueprint, with its strange, crowned M marking the hidden cavity. And then I pointed to the identical carving on the mantelpiece above the fire. The riddle wasn't just about where the treasure was, I explained. It was about what it was. Everyone was looking for a chest of gold coins, but Silas Blackwood was an artist. His gold wasn't something to be locked in a box. It was something to be transformed into a thing of beauty. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on my every word. "The treasure of Blackwood Manor is not in this house," I declared. "The treasure is this house, or a secret part of it." I then knelt down, and in front of the entire, stunned town, I reached into the firebox and I turned the small, hidden iron key. With a deep, groaning sound of old metal, the secret door at the back of the fireplace swung open. A collective gasp went through the room. "I cannot take you all in," I said. "The space is very small, but I would like to invite a few people to be the first residents of Havenwood in over a century to see the real treasure of Silas Blackwood." I looked out at the crowd. "Mayor Abernathy," I said, "as the head of our town and our historical society, I believe you should be the first." The mayor looked stunned, but he nodded and stepped forward. "And Brenda," I said, my eyes finding hers in the crowd. Her face was a picture of shock. "As the town's most dedicated oral historian, I think it is only fitting that you see it, too." She just stared at me, speechless, and numbly made her way to the front. Finally, I looked to the back of the room. "And Arthur, my friend, my partner in this discovery, please?" Arthur beamed, his face full of a quiet, triumphant joy. With the three of them beside me, and with the entire town craning their necks to see, I took a powerful flashlight and I crawled through the opening, into the darkness. I waited until I heard them crawl in behind me. I let the silence build for a moment in our small, dusty crawl space, and then I turned on the flashlight and aimed it at the far wall. The reaction was everything I had hoped for. The silence was absolute. And then came the gasps, a sharp, incredulous intake of breath from Mayor Abernathy, a low, disbelieving whistle from Arthur, and a small, choked, whimpering sound from Brenda. The beam of my flashlight was dancing across the wall of gleaming, intricately etched, golden panels. The light refracted in 1,000 different directions, making the small, hidden room feel like the inside of a jewel box. "My God," Mayor Abernathy whispered, his voice full of a reverence I had never heard from him before. He reached out a trembling hand, but did not dare to touch it. What is this?" "This," I said, my own voice full of a pride and an awe that I didn't have to fake, "is the real legacy of Silas Blackwood. Not a chest of coins. His life story, his mind, his autobiography, written in gold and bronze." I spent the next 10 minutes in that small, secret room, giving the 3 most influential people in Havenwood a private tour of their town's greatest secret. I showed them the drawings, the equations, the philosophical quotes. I explained what Dr. Finch had told me about the fire gilding, about the pricelessness of the art, of the history. When we finally crawled back out into the library, the entire room was silent, every eye fixed on us, waiting. Mayor Abernathy stood up, his face pale, his expression one of profound, humbled awe. He looked at me, no longer with skepticism, but with a new, deep respect. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice a little shaky, I have just seen a miracle. The legend is true, but the story we all thought we knew, was wrong. This woman," he said, turning to me, "this brilliant, dedicated young woman, has not just restored a house, she has restored our history. She has solved the mystery of Blackwood Manor. She has found the gold." The room erupted. The sound was not just applause. It was a roar of shock, of excitement, of a town seeing its own tired, old ghost story be transformed into something real, something beautiful, something true. And I stood there, in the warm glow of the firelight, in the house that was now truly mine. And I smiled. The whispers were finally over. The gossip was silenced. I was no longer the foolish outsider. I was the woman who had found the gold. And I was finally home. The last guest departed from Blackwood Manor just after midnight, their cars crunching slowly down the gravel driveway, their voices hushed with a new kind of awe. The house, which for so long had been a place of silence and decay, was quiet once more, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the warm, breathing silence of a house that had just been filled with life, a house whose oldest secret had finally been told. I stood in the grand library with Arthur, the fire having died down to a bed of glowing embers. The empty glasses and plates had been cleared away by the caterers, but the energy of the party, the ghost of that collective, astonished gasp, still lingered in the air. "Well," Arthur said, a slow, deeply satisfied smile on his face, "I do believe that went rather well. The town of Havenwood hasn't been this speechless since the great maple syrup flood of 1978. I laughed, a tired but genuinely happy sound. "You think they believe it now?" "My dear Eleanor," he said, his eyes twinkling, "you didn't just show them a room of gold. You showed them a room full of their own foolishness. You held up a mirror to a century of their own willful ignorance. Believe me, they will never look at this house, or you, the same way again." He was right. The shift was immediate and absolute. I, who had been the town's resident crazy lady, the foolish outsider from the city, was suddenly, overnight, its resident genius, its hero. Brenda from the general store was the first to wave the white flag of surrender. She showed up on my doorstep the next morning, holding a freshly baked apple pie, a peace offering, her face, usually a mask of sharp-eyed, gossipy suspicion, was a new and unfamiliar landscape of fawning, nervous respect. "Eleanor, dear," she said, her voice a good 2 octaves higher than usual. I just had to come by and say, that was the most remarkable thing I have ever seen. We were all so wrong about you, about everything. We are so lucky to have someone with your vision in our town." I accepted her pie and her clumsy, self-serving apology with a gracious smile. I was not interested in punishing her. Her own public humiliation was punishment enough. Mayor Abernathy requested a formal meeting at the town hall that afternoon. He was a changed man. The stern, condescending gatekeeper was gone, replaced by a humbled, deeply embarrassed public servant. "Mrs. Vance, Eleanor," he began, fumbling with his papers, "on behalf of the town of Havenwood and the Historical Society, I wish to offer you our most profound apologies for our skepticism, for our lack of vision." He looked at me, his eyes full of a new, desperate hope. "That room, those panels, it is a discovery of national importance, a treasure. We will, of course, offer you the full resources of the town to help you, well, to help you do whatever it is you decide to do with it." And that was the question, wasn't it? The treasure was priceless. The metallurgist in Boston had confirmed that the value of the gold alone was in the tens of millions of dollars. The artistic and historical value was, as he had put it, incalculable. I could have had the panels carefully removed, sold them to a private collector or a major museum, and I would have been wealthy beyond my wildest dreams. I could have bought a yacht, a private island, a life of leisure. I thought about it for about 5 minutes, and then I thought about Silas Blackwood, the brilliant, lonely man who had spent his life creating this house, this puzzle, this monument to his own mind. He hadn't transformed his gold into a work of art just so it could be melted down and turned back into a number in a bank account. He didn't want his legacy to be a price tag. He wanted his legacy to be understood. He wanted his story to be told. I went back to Mr. Abernathy the next day with a proposal, my own vision. "I am not going to sell the Golden Room," I told him. "I am going to preserve it, exactly as it is, where it is." He looked at me, confused. "But the value, the security?" "The value," I said, "is in the story, and I'm going to use that story to save this house and to give this town a new future." My plan was simple. We would use the discovery itself, the now famous story of the lost Golden Room of Havenwood, as leverage. With Mr. Harrison's legal help and Mr. Abernathy's official town backing, we applied for a series of major grants from the National Trust for Historic Preservation and from several large arts and humanities foundations. The story was so compelling, so unique, that the funding came pouring in, but it wasn't quite enough to fund the full, multi-year, multi-million-dollar restoration the manor deserved. So, I made one strategic sacrifice. There was a single, small, detached panel in the Golden Room, an epilogue to the main story, that depicted Silas's family tree, with the blessing of the State Historical Commission. We had it professionally removed. We offered it for sale, not to a private collector, but to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. They paid a handsome, 7-figure sum for it, and it now hangs in their American wing, a small, glittering piece of Havenwood on display for the entire world. The sale of that one, single panel, created the endowment. The Blackwood Manor Museum and Cultural Center now had its funding for the next 100 years. 2 years have passed, the work is complete, and today is the grand opening. Blackwood Manor is no longer a dark, crumbling ruin on a hill. It is a jewel. It has been restored to its former glorious beauty. Every piece of woodwork has been polished. Every pane of stained glass has been cleaned. The gardens have been replanted. The house is alive again, breathing with a new purpose, and the entire town of Havenwood is here to celebrate. The lawn is filled with people, with music, with laughter. The whispers are gone, replaced by a buzz of pride and excitement. Our town, the sleepy little town that no one had ever heard of, is now a destination. It has a national treasure. I stand on the front porch, the same porch I had stood on 2 years ago, with a set of rusty keys and a heart full of grief. I am no longer the foolish outsider. I am the director and chief curator of the Blackwood Manor Museum, the respected guardian of our town's history. Arthur, my dear friend, is the head of our new research library and archives, happily presiding over Silas's books and journals. The museum's centerpiece, of course, is the Golden Room. It is now protected behind a state-of-the-art, Climate-controlled glass wall, soft. Carefully placed lights illuminate the golden panels, making them glow with a warm, inner fire. Visitors walk through the small, hidden space in a state of hushed, reverent awe, listening on their audio guides as I tell them the story of Silas's life, of his genius, of his riddle. I have come to realize that the mansion was never really haunted by the ghost of Silas Blackwood. It was haunted by a different kind of ghost. The ghost of the town's own greed. They were so busy chasing the childish legend of a pot of gold. They failed to see the real treasure that was all around them. The treasure of their own unique and fascinating history. My grandfather used to tell me that the greatest value is often hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with the patience and the wisdom to see it. He was right. By choosing to respect Silas's mind instead of just hunting for his money, I was able to unlock his true legacy. I didn't just find his gold, I found his soul, and I gave it back to the town that had misunderstood him for so long. So, I'll leave you with this. The world is full of ghost stories, of simple, easy legends that we tell ourselves because the truth is often more complicated, more challenging, but the truth is always more valuable. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever felt like an outsider, or like you were the only one who could see the true beauty in something that everyone else had dismissed as worthless, I see you. Your vision is a gift. Hit that subscribe button if you believe in looking past the whispers to find the truth. And remember, the greatest treasures are never buried in a chest. They are all around us, hidden in plain sight, just waiting for someone with the heart to see them.